Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Cell-Based Meat webinar. My name is Anton Brevde. I'm a partner at Prime Movers Lab. Special welcome to our attendees. We have some of our LPs I see here. Special welcome to our new Growth Fund LPs. Thank you for partnering with us, and founders and other people from the ecosystem. If this is your first time meeting us, Prime Movers Lab invests in breakthrough scientific inventions that have the ability to impact billions of lives across a wide range of industries: energy, infrastructure, manufacturing, transportation, human augmentation, and finally, agriculture. And today we'll be talking about cell-based meat, of course. This is an area that is of intense interest to us. And as we think about things that can impact billions of lives, this is definitely on the short list. And, the existing livestock industrial complex poses many challenges, both environmental and ethical, and also in terms of human health as well. And so excited by the experts and panelists that we have joining us to kind of delve into that and why this is such important work. And some quick housekeeping. This will be an hour-long webinar. We'll do some Q&A towards the end, so we'll definitely welcome the audience to submit questions either via chat or via Q&A, and then we'll run those by the panelists towards the end. And with that, let me kick it over to Caleb, who's my co-host for this event, to introduce himself.
Thank you very much, Anton. It is a pleasure to be here. This is a really exciting webinar for me. As some of you may know, I started my professional career off as a chef. I spent 12 years doing that. My first two businesses were restaurants. I then went on and got a PhD in chemistry and founded a company in the stem cell regenerative medicine space. So this area is very, very near and dear to my heart and of huge interest. But of more interest to all of you are probably the amazing entrepreneurs we have on here to speak with us today. So I'll turn it over to them to give a little introduction to themselves, and then Anton and I will go into some questions and learn more about this area. Brian, would you mind giving us a little introduction, please?
Sure, happy to, yeah. So I'm Brian Spears, the founder and CEO of New Age Meats. And my background is engineering. So trained as a chemical engineer and then worked for 12 years in research in industrial automation. And so that essentially means working with early stage research companies or institutions. So like NASA, some US and Canadian national labs, universities and such, in order to basically work at the frontier of science in order to move to do fundamental research. So a lot of hardware software integration, a lot of understanding of where the data comes from. And then also we work with early stage product companies. So we work with some companies like Cisco and GE and Intel and Boeing, 3M, et cetera. So we worked on that early research phase, but then also moved from research into development, into production. All the time asking, how do you move as quickly as possible, making quality products through that research to production pipeline? So I was in that for 8 years, co-founded a company, ran that for 8 years in that space as well. Increasingly became concerned about the impact of what I was doing on the planet. So essentially what all of that boils down to is we make more, better, faster, cheaper products for everybody. And more, better, faster, cheaper products means you're consuming more, means you're creating more of a mess, frankly. And so instead of helping the earth to be where I want it to be, I was actually hindering the possible growth of humanity and making a more sustainable environment for the animals that share the planet with us. And so after a couple of years sabbatical where I went and tried to figure out what it is I wanted to do, I landed on this field and couldn't be happier.
All right. Thank you very much, Brian. We are happy to have you and your experience here for the panel today. Nia, could you give us a little background on yourself, please?
Sure. I'm Nia Gupta. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Pork and Good. We're based in New York City, and we're a cell-based meat company, and our initial products are in ground pork. So with me, it's interesting. So I have like a farming family in India, so I've just been like an ag nerd forever. And my first sort of career was in conventional agriculture. And I ended up, spending 10 years there and was doing things like advising the Minister of Agriculture in Nigeria how to set up feedlots, and was just incredibly conflicted at that point because my whole career was around ag productivity. And I was passionate about that. I'm passionate about food ecosystems. And I couldn't turn around and say, Nigeria, don't do this. Like, import your cheap meat from intensive farms off of Latin America and the US. But I also knew with these productive models, they were importing issues with antibiotic resistance and like environmental issues and like all the risks that basically come with factory farming. And long story short, like my ag head like connected with Dr. Gabor Forgacz's tissue engineering brain. And he was one of the co-founders of Modern Meadow, which was one of the first companies attempting this idea, but it actually had abandoned it for never getting to like a commercial viable product. And those two sides of the coin kind of created magic and like creating a new way of approaching this. And we started Fork and Good.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for that background. And last but not least, Ryan, could you give us a little background on yourself?
Thanks, Caleb. Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Bethencourt. I am the CEO and founder of Wild Earth. We are the leading commercial stage international plant-based pet food company. We currently sell our products across the US, India, and actually in Hong Kong as well. So I co-founded Wild Earth a little over 3 years ago, from idea all the way through to commercial launch. We currently have 8 products on the market today. We're growing rapidly. We grew about 10x last year in terms of revenue. And so my background is I actually co-founded IndieBio, which was and still is one of the leading biotech accelerators. I led that with my 2 other co-founders. For a little under 4 years. We funded a whole bunch of future food companies, some of which you've probably heard of. You know, Memphis Meats, obviously New Age Meats. Brian is here as well. Finless Foods and several others. I was actually putting my tally together because after leaving IndieBio and starting Wild Earth, I continued to invest. So I personally cut angel checks and eventually raised a sidecar fund where I invested in a total of about 12 future of food and particularly cell-based meat companies. Across the world. So I was the first angel investor in a company called Shiok Meats. I cut them their first check and several other companies which we can definitely talk about. But I have a definite perspective about how disruptive the plant-based, recombinant, and cell-based replacement of all animal-derived products is going to be. And I think that opportunity, depending on how you look at it, is about $2 trillion market, which is already being disrupted, right? We're already seeing plant-based unicorns today. And we're going to start seeing we're starting to see recombinant unicorns, and we will very soon start seeing cell-based unicorns. I think we're going to see dozens and dozens of these.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan and Nia and Brian, for joining us. I think maybe just to kind of set the stage for the attendees, maybe 1 or 2 or all of you could speak to why this matters. Why is this important? What are some of the issues that are caused by the existing meat infrastructure, livestock infrastructure, and kind of where our meat comes from today?
Sure, I'll jump in first. Keep going in this order. I kind of mentioned earlier that if you step back, and I went on, like I mentioned, I went on a sabbatical for 2 years to go figure out what the biggest problems are facing humanity, and climate change is the biggest one. It is the tsunami that is coming to possibly destroy everything. And I also have a deep conviction that humanity isn't actually worth saving if we don't become a better species, frankly. If we're just looking to continue the same infrastructure and treat other people and other animals and the planet the way we're already treating them, we're not fixing anything. We're actually gonna make the problem worse. So we need to move to a better system of producing the goods that we really want. So that means in my book, taking animals entirely out of the value chain. So right now, animals are very firmly embedded in the value chain of creating meat. So the goal of my company is to entirely remove them from the value chain. And that makes us a more kinder, sustainable species, and one worthy of continuing on to be an interplanetary species, for instance.
That's interesting. I have a slightly different take, maybe because I'm coming from the world of agriculture. You know, most of the world still grows using like sustenance ag, right? With less than 2 acres, it's not the most efficient, it's not the most productive. And as much as we'd like to change it, like there's so much about agriculture, which is so difficult and ingrained and part of like a whole political ecosystem or a socio-economic fabric. So I don't know if I can say, let's take animals out, because there's ways of ag that we've been doing, which will, I think, persist for tens and thousands of years. All of that being said, like even the most productive and efficient ways, as Brian is saying, are way, way, way too costly to the environment, but also vice versa, in that the supply chains themselves are being impacted by how they're structured. So if we want to keep eating meat that is high quality, that is safe, we need other ways. We need other ways of hedging because it's not working now. And I think the strongest case for that was this past year in COVID, where our meat supplies just broke down. They just completely broke down. And not to mention that sort of 2/3 of this pandemic type viruses are coming off of factory farms, right? So if we think about some of the huge public health issues facing us and just even wanting to keep eating meat in a way that's safe for us, we need other solutions.
And Ryan, maybe before you jump in with your answer, if I could layer on a part 2 to this, that I'd be curious to get your thoughts, because you had mentioned there's a few different ways of providing new sources of protein for us, plant-based, recombinant, or cell-based. So maybe also just kind of layering in why one over the other, or and extend the question to Nia and Brian as well. Why not work on a plant-based protein? Why do you guys think that cell-based or clean meat or cultured meat is what the solution should be?
So I think it's really important to remind everyone that's listening right now, food is technology, right? Fundamentally, food is technology, which basically means it will continue to evolve. We put it on hold about 10,000 years ago. Our ancestors domesticated both crops and animals, and it's been kind of on hold. And so what we're realizing is, from an economics perspective, right, from a demographics perspective, it's over the next 20, 30 years, we're going to need to double our food production to be able to feed the next 10 billion people that are going to be on this planet. We just can't do it. We don't have enough space. There's no more Amazons to cut down to make space to make more food. And so either we use technology to innovate our way out, or we don't feed people, right? And of course, the answer is not we don't feed people. And so the reality of it is we have to get more efficient. What we've seen with both plant-based, recombinant, and cell-based is we're seeing efficiency improvements of 70 to 90%, right? Reductions in use of water, land, energy, all sorts of things in terms of the efficient use of calories, which essentially, when we look at most energy units on this planet, comes from the sun, right? So basically photosynthetic energy gets turned into proteins in plants. Those plants get eaten, let's say, by animals, or we take those proteins and we process them and make plant-based meat analogs or plant-based alternatives, or we take the sugars, we ferment it, and we make fermented recombinant proteins, right? So these are 3 very specific examples. I think these are technology curves. So when we look at it, it's like plant-based is one curve. We've got recombinant, which is another curve that's coming. And then the final curve is cell-based, right? That moves us away pretty much, real animals or real meat isn't going away, but it will be more of a, people, like more reminiscent of people who hunt their own meat, right? Like there will be people who feel like they need to have the original thing. And that'll always be there. But the reality of it is, to efficiently feed the planet, humanity, we need to use all of these technologies. One really important report that I highly recommend everyone listening to this read is Rethink X. So Rethink X is, they wrote a report called Disrupting the Cow. It's a think tank run by Tony Seba. He basically predicted the cost curve and predicted when both solar and clean energy would actually become cost competitive, as well as electric cars. And so he advises sovereign wealth funds. You can check out his reports. He talks about this a lot. He has a report, it's free. I highly recommend it. He talks about how what's going to start happening is plant-based is the beginning of the disruption of many of these animal ag-based industries. They're already going bankrupt. So the first dairy, I think the largest dairy company in the US in 2019 went bankrupt shortly after that report came out. We're going to start to see more of these bankruptcies because the animal ag industries and the farming industries are not profitable industries. They're basically propped up. The moment you start taking away any aspect of their products or their margins, they're going to start collapsing like crazy. So by RethinkX predicts by 2030 to 2035, between 80 to 90% of existing animal ag industries are basically essentially going to be effectively bankrupt.
Right.
And by the way, I've had this conversation with a large landowner in Brazil, owns chunks of the Amazon. And he's like, so are you telling me I need to sell my ranches? And I was like, yeah, unless you want to go bankrupt.
Right.
He was a billionaire. He's a billionaire. I could probably tell you who it was, but he's a billionaire, a Brazilian billionaire. He spent a little time in and out of prison, whatever else. The Brazilian thing is very crazy. But it's true. Like, if people don't want to see the truth, that's fine. They can go bankrupt. But we're there to take the opportunity.
Sorry to break in here.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting. And one of the points that you touched on that I didn't want to lose there was that, this is technology. We have had a little bit of a technological advance along the way with fast food. And that is not really real food, right? And actually, I'd say it's a net negative. The thing I wanted to fold in here, and Nia, I'd like to get your opinion on this. As a retired chef, what about the nutritional value and the flavor of these alternatives, the taste that we're bringing to the forefront with this next wave in technology for food tech?
That's actually exactly the point I was going to make around like cell-based versus other alternatives versus plant-based or all of this. So first of all, I would say it's not never either or, right? Like these foods all have different choices for different people optimizing on different things, right? And for somebody who chooses not to eat meat and who only has chain restaurants available to them and they can finally get a form of protein that's like non-meat based, like how exciting, to have like a Beyond Meat patty or what have you. But I think at the core of it, right, like I think you need all of these as choices, but I don't see those plant-based alternatives being true substitutes, right? So I don't see that like really processed patty being in the center of all of our kids' plates for every single meal, right? And I hope those products improve and that does become a reality. But so far I haven't seen that. And I'm a huge foodie too. It's part of why we're based in New York City. And I haven't tasted anything that like compares. I mean, I've had some interesting takes on like burgers made of cantaloupe and all of this other stuff. But I think if you believe that there's something about animal protein, which is core to our nutrition, which I do, like, and I don't think it's at the levels of the average American, by the way, but like, I do think like, even the UN has published like this report of like the ideal diet does have some animal protein. It's made like massive differences like in Asia where I'm from, like of just, how people develop. And so there's something so important about that nutrition. And it's not just, and cell-based has that identical nutrition, right? Like the cells are cells. We've been eating them for millennia. Like it's the same thing. And that nutrition, and you might know this as a chef, Caleb, but nutrition and taste are usually linked, right? And that's how we've evolved. And so we've had like global experts try our stuff blindfolded, when it's only one cell type, it's not, whether it doesn't even look palatable, and their first response, their instinctual response is meat, right? And that's what I think is hard to get in like other areas of alternatives that are not cell-based.
They are linked, but sometimes inversely. French fries taste delicious.
That is true. But think about any natural product, like a sweet tomato is a healthier tomato. And I'll make one other quick point to something you said, Caleb, about like we've innovated in fast food. We've innovated in farming, like in types of seeds, but also in how we grow, like in hydroponics. Like my first business is hydroponics farming, and I see so many parallels between the two, right? Like a fraction less land, creating an ideal environment, creating something nourishing, but just taking out soil as the vector. Except in this case, we're taking the animal out as the vector.
Brian, how are you guys thinking about that over at New Age?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think I started looking at the space late 2016 and then early 2017, and then we formally started working on it in November 2017. And I would say it took us about a month, maybe 3 weeks, to determine that bringing a majority cultivated meat product to market is the wrong strategy. The idea that you need to go make a product which is as close as possible to meat, as in 90 or whatever, 80, 90, 100%, 100% are difficult, but cultivated meat product to market is a losing strategy. And for a variety of reasons. The biggest reason, I think, is simply the unit economics and the fact that the plant-based side actually provides some really compelling features. So it's really good at the appearance. If you look at it, if you look at a plant-based meat product, it's very difficult to determine that it's something different, especially on the ground side. And then on the structure side, it does pretty well as well. There are some areas where it's missing, like in the flavor, the mouthfeel. There's certain things that the plant toolkit currently can't replicate, and the cells can do that. And so when you think about, well, what's the best that the cells can do, what's the best that the plants can do, well, the ideal situation is to go and combine them. And by so doing, you can drop dramatically the cost and increase the scale and make a product that's better than anything in the market, and will continue to be better than anything in the market, because that uses both toolkits, the plant toolkit and also the cell toolkit. So we don't come down hard on saying cultivated meat is going to win or cell-based meat is going to win, whatever you call it. And we don't say the plant-based meat is going to win. We say like the solution is obviously a hybrid product.
Thank you, Brian. To maybe build on your point about unit economics, and Ryan, when you were speaking about the cost curve, if we were to put on our investor hat here and kind of think about the all important question of why now, I mean, I think to me it's very clear that this is eventually going to happen. And Andreessen famously says that there is no bad idea. It all just comes down to market timing. So maybe we can talk a little bit about kind of the cost curve and how it's changed. A lot of people know famously the first cell-based burger patty was made in 2013. Dr. Mark Post reportedly cost $300,000. So it'd be interesting to hear kind of where are we at now in that cost curve. What have been the biggest drivers, and kind of what are the remaining bottlenecks to get it to a point where we can be in a mass market adoption place? And that's a beefy question. Nia or Ryan want to maybe take a stab at it?
Yeah, Nia, Brian, why don't you guys go first?
I can go. I'll go again. Why not? Yes. So on the cost curve, so we think that we talked to a lot of, for instance, investors in the space, and I think that quite a few of them take this kind of laundry list approach. Say like, okay, you're a cultivated meat company. You look like this. You have these types of things we care about. And they'll say like, okay, what about your immortalization? What about your cell lines? What about your serum-free media? What's your cost per liter? Things like that. So just they kind of like tick through a series of boxes. And I think that there are some implications there that we think are wrong. I think that the more, in our book, the more important thing to make is an entire product which replaces meat, which people eat instead of conventional or slaughtered meat. The definition of meat is changing. And so your job is to go make a product that people see that meets the fundamental needs that people have when they eat meat. Why do you eat meat? What is the experience of eating meat? What does it deliver to your body, to your identity? Recognize that we're making that. We're not making cells. We're not a cell making company. We are a meat making company. And so the most important thing to talk about is the price per unit of the product itself. And we make that, and that has been steadily dropping since the beginning and will continue to drop, because we recognize that we can take the best inputs from a variety of streams. As I mentioned, the plant-based side, the cell-based side, the microbial fermentation side as well. Essentially, we are recreating that experience of eating meat, because the definition of meat is changing and evolving.
What do you think, Nia?
I can speak just sort of to because we have this interesting history just about like the cost evolution a little bit. So what Mark Post did for like the 300K burger was really traditional lab scale tissue culture. It was like flasks and growing cells in 2 dimensions with nothing automated, with like one intern that we know who has now his like own cell-based meat company. It was crazy, like completely manual. And I think I can reveal that with Modern Meadow, when they tried, they were really scaling up the process. They had like a completely different set of criteria they were optimizing towards. It wasn't lab scale tissue culture, but there wasn't really like a breakthrough at the core of it either. And just by changing the parameters of what you were optimizing for, they were able to get in the sort of like $7,000 to $10,000 a pound range. No one's going to buy that, right? And then now, like several years later, we're seeing like the next wave of companies were like publicizing sort of the thousands of dollars that have been achieved, right? And then depending on how much you're a purist for 100% or a blend, as Brian is talking about, that can maybe range into like the hundreds to thousands. Now for us, like I don't know what everyone else is doing, but like the reason for starting Fork and Good was the unit economics. And it was that we could see like a way to get to being at or below the price of meat. And so we definitely have a vision of reaching that, right? And then in the next even couple of years, targeting sort of in the tens of dollars range. So just industry-wise, you're seeing like massive magnitudes of cost reduction.
What's the biggest bottleneck to, we have a few more like orders of magnitude to go. Like what's the thing that you wish existed or that you're working on that you can speak to?
Well, I don't want to like monopolize. Ryan, did you want to like weigh in on this conversation or?
I can, but why don't you go ahead, Nia? Why don't you answer the question? And I have some more meta thoughts. Yeah.
I think that each company is taking a unique approach that they think is solving the cost, but this is like kind of a Rubik's Cube of everything is linked to each other. And people are starting to like crack the path that they think will get to the cost. And there's probably going to be multiple winners. But I think now what the bottleneck is less about cracking it, because there are different people who crack different elements. Now it's about scale, because we're like building a brand new physical supply chain. This isn't like software where you crack it and then you just like 10x the sort of like users that are like interfacing with your app or something like that. And it's a brand new biological processes that you're building physical infrastructure for, that now can't be for like research grade cell production. You're talking about an average meat processing facility doing thousands of tons. Thousands of tons is billions and billions and billions of cells even if you were only doing a 10% cell-based product. So that I think is like the next level up.
That is a perfect tee up for you, Ryan. From your experience and your background, and that Wild Earth is actually commercial today, and also your investing activities.
Yeah. So I'll start first with the meta perspective, right? Which is that, I think it's really important. We're talking about the theoretical and the science side of things. From a first principles perspective, right? This is cell-based meat is an offshoot of the regenerative medicine industry, which is old. This is 20-year-old technology. We're just bringing it into animal cells rather than human cells. And so biology, especially mammalian cells, are self-replicating systems. We know we can immortalize them. We have done it over and over and over again. And so from a first principles perspective, eventually where you get to is sugar water plus some growth hormones and some other things that you've brewed in yeast with sugar water, plus a tank that increasingly scales. As you continue to scale, the price continues to drop and drop and drop. We do this at scale today in the middle of cornfields and sugarcane fields. You can actually see these huge tanks. Those are fermentation tanks. We do it already. This technology already exists in many different ways. And here's the really important thing. And I've talked to a few companies that are now claiming they're about $100 per pound. It's hard to verify that, but we're getting very, very close. That basically means certain things like bluefin tuna are now cost competitive, right? Cell-based bluefin tuna and some other higher end meats are now cost competitive based on some of these prices. And this is the most important point. This is no longer theoretical. So Eat Just, actually, I think it was last month, got approval to start selling, commercial approval in Singapore to start selling chicken. And so I don't think they're selling it profitably, but the whole point is they are now approved to sell, and they are selling cell-based chicken in Singapore. No longer theoretical, no longer sci-fi, no longer maybe happening. It's happening, and now we need to scale. Like to Nia's point, right? This is just a scaling problem. This is an engineering problem, right? And so that, I think that's where I really start. And then, from the perspective of Wild Earth, and this hasn't come out publicly yet, but it'll be out in The Economist, I think this week, in print and online. I talked to The Economist. We basically said that we're going to come out with cell-based meat pet food. We'll have our first launch product, and it's going to be a flavoring. So this is how we get around it. It's going to be a flavoring. I'm kind of giving a few secrets away. It's going to be a flavoring, and we're going to be adding that to our existing product line, which is nutritionally complete anyway. But we know that pet parents really want to have, beef, chicken, seafood flavors for their pets. And so we're targeting by the end of this year, so the end of 2020, to have first launch products. We don't require, for flavorings, we don't require any new regulatory pathways in the US. Not required. So if the USDA and the FDA figure it out, they will be lagging behind Singapore, probably Israel, which will probably be next to approve. China is saying that they're planning on approving at some point soon. So the US is going to be lagging in terms of cell-based meat approval. It'll happen, right? Because there'll be too much pressure for this not to happen. And it's going to be happening in human food, and it's going to be happening in pet food. The reason that I'm particularly focused in pet food is today it's a global $90 billion market. The US alone, it's about a $30 billion market. We are the leaders in plant-based. I intend for us to be the leaders in cell-based as well. So
really interesting. And I know my dog loves Wild Earth treats. She has had them before. You brought up a couple really good points that I'd like to actually expand the conversation and drill down on. But before I do that, I'd like to remind our audience, please, if you have questions, type them into the chat. We will try and fold things in as we go. So Ryan, maybe I could come back to you on this. There's two things that are touch base on in there. One, a lot of things happening in Asia. Different countries, different geographies have different flavor profiles and different acceptances of certain things, and also different regulatory frameworks, right? And it is a twofold question. You have to get your thing through the FDA or the PMDA or whatever equivalent, but that doesn't get you to the market. There is also a court of public opinion. We had some issues with GMO food in the past, which from a scientist perspective, I would much prefer use a genetically modified food than something you sprayed a ton of pesticides on, right? But the court of public opinion in European markets said no. So as you're seeing this stacking out, you mentioned a couple geographies. How are you weighing the flavor profile of acceptance in the court of public opinion and also those regulatory frameworks?
So I can speak about this from a much broader food perspective, right? So I've been with the Rolling Fund. Basically, I started side investing my own money into future food companies across the world, right? I basically viewed it as, we are seeing a boom in, and that's obvious if you look at publicly listed stocks that are plant-based, or if you look at private valuations, right, are just exploding, like Oatly with a $2 billion valuation, it's oat milk. But it's like you start to see this stuff, and it's like either the market is totally insane, which is possible, or there's some wisdom there somewhere. And I believe there's actually wisdom around the broader mega trends of alternative proteins and the future of food. And so there will be regional champions. That was my original bet when I cut the first angel check to Shiok Meats. They are now the leader in Asia when it comes to cell-based meat. They actually make shrimp and lobster, right? And so it was a thesis that there would be national champions and they would be supported by those regional governments. And so we're going to see more and more of this, right? Israel has been honestly an incredible executor on this. If you look at Israel have put tons of support behind cell-based meat. And they are now, I would say, the second largest hub after the US in terms of cell-based meat companies. And they're very, very good companies. I mean, the technology that comes out of those, the technions and various other things, that is solid science. So I think that, there will be regional leaders, and it will be developed to individual regional tastes as well. I recently invested in Nigeria's first plant-based meat company called Veggie Victory, and plant-based meat. But they make chunks. So I was like, what is chunk? Why do you make a Beyond Burger? And Hakeem, the founder and CEO, was like, we don't eat burgers, Ryan. Like, that's not our thing. And so I was like, oh, he was like, yeah, we have chunks with rice. Like, that's our thing. And so we're going to see companies that develop. I mean, Nigeria alone is a 200 million person market today. In about 20 years, it's going to be 400 million people, larger than the US, right? So it's like, we need to be thinking as we build companies and as we invest in the future, we need to be thinking about 2030. What does 2030 look like? Like, what do those markets look like? And there will be regional winners and regional flavors, 100% kidding.
Excellent. Maybe could I turn this to Nia for a second? You grew up in India, correct?
Well, actually, Hong Kong.
Hong Kong. Okay.
But my family is Indian, and our farms are in India. Yeah.
I've done a lot of business and spent a lot of time in Japan, and and the population. When you think about the population of China, India, Southeast Asia, I mean, this is the huge majority on the planet. And there are some things over there. There are delicious insects. There are delicious parts of things that we would not touch in the US that I actually greatly enjoy. How do you see some of those other things coming in? Are there opportunities? And to Ryan's point of scale and regional, those are bigger scales. Now, they may not be what we eat in the US, but the number of people on the planet that eat them and the capacity of insects and fungi to grow very rapidly outstrip the ability to grow a steak in some respects. Could you add some color to this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say like one aspect of cell-based meat that's different from plant-based is because it is just meat, it's less about then like creating this specific sort of product. So like, whereas Beyond sausage, for example, would have to completely reinvent itself to be pork dumpling filler in Hong Kong and China, like our ground pork would just be ground pork, right? So it would be more like translatable to like global markets. But in terms of like what we eat in so India is actually one of the lowest like per capita meat consumptions in the world. And we still face this issue because people are starting to like eat chicken and other types of meat at such faster rates, right? The rates of growth is one of the highest. But one part, I was just talking about this the other day to someone, is like, I think what we do so brilliantly, at least in India, is like legumes. And like the potential for the chickpea is like really underexploited, I think, in like the rest of the world. Nowhere in Asia or India are insects actually that prevalent, right? Like they are in some parts of Southeast Asia, but they're like reflecting sort of times of hardship, and like people don't really love those products that much because they're reflecting those times of hardship. And so that there is, first of all, like a global diet where everyone's just eating more meat. And when you have people going into the middle class, that for sure is happening. But if there's a page that the rest of the world can take out of, say, India's book to have like a more sustainable diet, it's to think about like repurposing legumes for like almost anything.
And Nia, I just wanted to speak to that. I mean, the amount of indigenous crops in India, there's a huge variety. Just recently, I backed a dahi company that's made out of millet. So they use millet as the primary protein source, as an alternative to the yogurt that's used for many dishes. And so I think that we're going to start seeing more of this, which is like regional products, right? In Accra in Ghana, we backed an almond milk company. It's actually a local type of almond that doesn't require as much water, right? As Western almonds, things like that, where we're going to see just a broad variety of precursor plants or bioreactors that's going to be tailored to that environment.
Quick thought on that as we speak about regulation and actually related to your comment about milk and nut milk. There are large incumbents in this market, right? And large incumbents don't go down without a fight. One of the interesting things I came across as I've been researching this sector is, quote unquote, big meat doesn't want to make the same mistake that the dairy industry made by allowing, quote unquote, allowing nut milk, alternative milk companies to be called milk. And I guess there are efforts by the incumbent livestock industry to block cell-based meat from being called meat, even though from a biological perspective, it's the same exact thing. Curious to get any of your thoughts on that. Have you encountered those types of hurdles at this point, and kind of how are you thinking about approaching that? Maybe starting with Brian, if you have any thoughts there.
Oh, we definitely encountered them. So they've been doing it for a while. I'm reminded of November 2018. Several of us testified but gave public comment on Capitol Hill to the joint FDA and USDA. And very well represented there were the cattlemen's associations, various cattlemen's association. And they are the biggest voice for everything you're saying, which is the meat industry attempting to define the definition of meat to be the product of the carcass of a slaughtered animal. So it's interesting to see, again, going back to even that instance of on Capitol Hill, that I think is probably, I would gauge 95% of the comments were coming from the cattlemen. So it's interesting. It's like, well, why weren't there many pork or chicken, other producers? Well, the reason is essentially those other producers are much more vertically integrated. So pork and chicken, for instance, from the hatching or from rearing the animal all the way through the slaughter, there's kind of one organization or a series of technologies that one organization handles. And so for them, if they can simply swap out the technology that creates the meat, but still manage all the downstream interfacing with the customers, the packaging, the distribution, the marketing, all that, then really they're just producing a better product for their consumers. So they're okay with that. Whereas on the Cattlemen's Association side, they tend to be more distributed. So at the upper end, you have a lot of cattlemen that, for instance, graze on federal land. So the federal land that the United States citizens presumably own. So they are able to get they pay a very small cost in order to graze those cattle and then literally feed them into the feeding lots, fatten them up for slaughter, et cetera. So in the new ecosystem that we're moving to, a lot of those players wonder about their space. And so they're the ones that are most vociferous about trying to keep the label in the tied to the carcass of the slaughtered animal. But encouragingly, the big meat players don't care about that. They care about the relationship with the consumer and delivering the meat that the consumer wants. And increasingly, the consumer is demonstrating that they want the future of meat. The alternative proteins are changing. You can see this in double-digit adoption year over year, high double-digit adoption year over year in plant-based meat, that people are changing. You can see this in the younger generation. If you go look at who is adopting plant-based meat, it's increasing the younger generation. And so the big meat companies see the writing on the wall. And so they're on board with changing that. And you can see that with even energy companies, Exxon and BP, et cetera, they see that the end of fossil fuels is nigh. They better pivot and follow new forms of energy. And so good, smart companies will do that.
Yeah, I can definitely weigh in. So both Brian and I are a part of the US-based coalition, which is called the Alliance for Innovation in Meat, Poultry, and Seafood. And we, as an industry, work together with both the USDA and the FDA for charting out how a regulatory framework will be in place, and the level of just integrity and cooperation, Speediness's work, it is very impressive. My first company was in Singapore, so it's not going to work like Singapore because we are here in the US and bureaucracy works differently here. But it's very, very promising. And then so in terms of having a regulatory pathway where consumers can have a product that they feel is safe and trusted because there's been a sensible process worked out with agencies, 100% that's going to happen. In terms of what you're talking about, which is what do we get to call it and label it? There's kind of a backlash based off of plant-based where there's now this concern of sort of just lumping in cell-based with plant-based and sometimes not even knowing what cell-based is, right? So there is some work which the coalition is doing to also educate people what that is. And ultimately, we can't call it something else because that would be misleading to consumers. It wouldn't be transparent. And I think everybody understands that. And in all likelihood, we're going to have a modifier or some kind of signifier to show that this is not conventionally raised meat. And that's fine.
On that topic, Nia, a couple questions have come in from the audience that I could maybe ask you. How do you actually make it? How is
a great question for people who like aren't like us and who don't live and breathe and sleep and think about this stuff all the time. So going back to my hydroponics like analogy, right? Like where you just take like a seed and then you put it in like water with nutrition and then make sure that water is oxygenated and moving, and then the whole plant like sort of flourishes, but you don't need the soil. Kind of what Ryan mentioned, like mammalian cells, like muscle cells, fat cells, they divide. And what they need to divide is that same thing, like nutrition, like an animal's blood, like what an animal has eaten, the gases, you know, and to be in motion. And that is what we put into this thing called a bioreactor, which you can think of as like a tank. And the seed is just a small number of those cells. So you can get like a biopsy from an animal or isolate them from tissues or start with stem cells. There's lots of different ways to get your sort of starting cells. But then you put the cells in the tank and then you basically feed them, and then those cells divide. You collect up those cells and you then make those cells into a meat product.
So, and does that give me the flavor and the texture of filet mignon and prime rib and?
Much more complicated question, right? So like if we could figure out like prime rib, you know, I would just go and start like a multi-billion-dollar regenerative medicine company right now, right? Like, but that is like way, way harder to like think about in your head, like growing a whole leg and like a bone and like, you know, whereas like growing just the cells is like a simpler product, might not have a medical application, but delivers a lot of like the flavor and the nutrition that we were talking about earlier. But it may not give you the texture. So you need to think about like, you know, how you layer them or how you blend them and what else you use. So those muscle cells have identical nutrition to say like a pig or cow muscle cell, which is like, you know, 10% fatty acids, 70%, and we've done like all the analysis, right? So it has like the water and the proteins and the fatty acids in the exact same ratios, which give you that like instinctual meat like thing when you put it in your mouth. But, you know, it really depends on the product you're going for. Like, are you also growing fat? Are you just focusing on muscle? Are you just focusing on the fat part and then adding in plant-based protein? Are you trying to do connective tissue and muscle and fat? And whatever you pick in terms of these, you know, different building blocks that are available to you will affect your end product.
Really, really interesting. And this ties in a little bit to what Ryan mentioned earlier. I see there's a startup I know of in Japan that is 3D printing sushi because rather than prime rib, it's a small, it's, you know, low volume but high value product. Ryan, your company works on plant-based. Could you just again answer one of the audience questions? How do you put it together? And specifically, the specific question, how do you recapitulate the flavor?
So the beauty of pet food, and particularly dog food, is the dog just needs to eat the dog food, right? So even if it tastes like a different type of kibble, it's okay as long as they like the taste, whatever that taste is. So I kind of went for a problem which was, I would say, easier to solve than a human palate, right? Dogs just need to eat the dog food. And I've eaten the dog food too. So I went on to Shark. For those of you that haven't seen, I've been on Shark Tank. I closed Mark Cuban. You're welcome to watch the show. It's season 10, episode 16. All the sharks ate the wild earth kibble and whatever else. So we really focused on doing our product development. We had to figure out, what do dogs like? And so we had to, like, we came from the biotech industry. And so we basically had to come up with processes to like figure out what are the flavors that dogs love. It turns out that they're as long as it tastes savory and protein rich, it's okay. Like that, it usually works. And so one of the key, even though we call it plant-based, one of the key aspects to our food, which actually we have patented, we actually just got our USPTO approved patent earlier this week, which was really exciting. For our dog food, we use our alternative protein is yeast. And so yeast is 40% protein. And so we basically have the patent space for using fungi as the primary protein source in pet food. And so, we want to be an alternative protein leader across the category. So we're starting first with alternative proteins, fungi, yeast in this case, and koji as well. It's another type of fungi that we use. And then the aim is eventually to bring in cell-based meat increasingly over time. The food business is a scale business. And so you need to have scale to start rolling out some of these things. So because we're commercial scale company, I'll give you an example. In 2020, we fed 8 million meals, right? So that was 1.5 million pounds of dog food. That's what we shipped in 2020. And so as we get more and more breakthroughs that are happening, we actually have several partners now in the cell-based meat space that will provide us the ingredients to add into our product. So we have made mouse meat for cats. Not worth our time doing that because there's just so many complexities in actually scaling cell-based meat. We would much rather be on the consumer side and the brand side. And so that's really, really where we are. We build products. And sometimes the ingredients are cell-based meat, sometimes they're fungi, sometimes they're other things.
And Ryan, maybe a follow-up for you, since from your IndieBio experience and angel investing experience, you've seen a lot of companies as we have. What about some of the tangentially related companies that are being formed kind of in the space? For example, we have companies that are pursuing cell-based leather, right? Making animal materials, again, without actually having to slaughter an animal for it. Maybe you could speak to kind of what opportunities you see in these adjacent industries.
Happily. So I think it's massive. So through IndieBio, we invested in MycoWorks, which is using fungi to make leather. It's a type of fungi leather. I'm also an advisor to Vitro Labs, which actually use exotic animal cells, so ostrich, crocodile, and cow leather. They actually grow it as a textile. And so they actually are able to create a dermal layer. They have some partners, they haven't announced who they are, but these are luxury goods partners who would love, instead of selling a crocodile bag for $10,000, you had to slaughter a crocodile. It'd be great to have a crocodile bag that you actually grew in a lab, right? Maybe charge $20,000 for it instead. And then also, I'm actually on the board of a company called Gelitech. And so Gelitech makes collagen. And so they are actually looking at several partnerships with fashion houses to actually grow leather for those fashion houses as well. And so this is happening already, like actual replacement of leather, especially exotic leathers. So, when you think about even endangered animals, you no longer have to kill those animals to have really just beautiful leathers, skins. Vitro Labs was originally started to have mink and fox fur, but grown without the animal.
And interesting with mink, because I know with COVID, there was a big challenge. A lot of minks were put down. We are coming up to the tail end of our hour. I would like to start with you, Brian, on this next question, but then run around everyone. What are your predictions? Other than your company being massively successful in the next 5 or 10 years, which we're all confident because we wouldn't have invited you here if we didn't believe that. Other than that prediction, where do you see in this area and the adjacent ones that Ryan mentioned in the next 2 to 5 years, where are going to be the big wins or the big opportunities that open up?
Yeah, it's a great question. And Ryan gave a really good answer on some of the other markets where, as I mentioned before, animals are in the value chain. And so as a company in our space, that's super exciting. From the volume perspective of what is actually going back to the whole reason in the very beginning of the hour why we started the company. For me, it's a very mission impact company for me personally. And so what is the impact on the planet? What is the impact on the animals? And so volume, in our case, we're not content to be a low volume solution. So that's been floated around a few times here. Is like, what are the types of products that can come to market that are increasing or that can scale? How well can they scale? Like, how expensive will they be? Will you be limited to a luxury restaurant or a luxury good? So we tried to target. We don't target any of that. We target a volume market. So how do you get this product in the mouths of as many people as possible, make them happy eating a meat product, which right now, frankly, they're guilty about eating. So our target market is a guilty meat eater, the person that loves meat but hates the way it's made. And there are a lot of those people. And so yes, exactly. Our hands all around. So I think the biggest opportunity lies in changing essentially understanding why we eat meat and understanding what it delivers to your body and to your identity. That again is the biggest question. That goes to any of the products that currently are being met through the means of using an animal. Why do we use it? What does it deliver to us as a person? What does it deliver to, like, what's the actual functionality? And in most cases, we can make it better. We target first making our products very similar to what is already in the market, slaughtered meat, because we want to engender that trust and let consumers know that it is the same thing, that they can replace it. But very quickly, we can move to a better place because we have complete control over the cell. We have complete control over the ecosystem. We can make it safer, tastier, healthier, and it's a bright new world for us. It's a new age, one might say.
What about you, Nia? What are your predictions?
Market. Well, I think we're going to see some forms of like agriculture just sort of like start to recede. You know, like you're going to have restrictions on things like speed of kill lines or like how many animals you can put in one place, and also like just communities like will reject having, you know, like hog farms like next to them, sort of poisoning them, right? And what you will see instead, and you know, the average farmer right now is maybe like 65 years old, and there's not many people of our generation who are excited about that as a career path. And instead, like 5 or 10 years, 80% of the world's moved to cities. And there is a completely different fabric of what agriculture looks like, where there's some options which are like very pricey for the 1%, sort of organic farm type things, and like urban warehouses and rooftops and new meat cultivation facilities like near every city, that allow these cities to really just produce everything that they need. And then seeing like some synthetic solutions to, like Ryan mentioned, leather, but you know, there's real issues in like the coffee sector, the cocoa sector, you know, cotton, silk, like anything in agriculture, like anything where we're saying water is starting to be priced, right? Like water is going to be the crunch, climate is going to be the crunch. And we won't have any choice but to look at some of these like new formats for some of the things that we just really love. Else they just become a complete luxury.
Fantastic. Well, Ryan, I think we're hitting the hour, so everyone's going to have to go chase you down on the internet to hear your predictions. But I want to say a big thank you to our panelists. This was a really fun first panel. We're going to be doing these every other Wednesday for the rest of eternity. The one in 2 weeks will be on psychedelic investing and therapeutics, so that'll be another fun one. Be at the same time. We'll be sending out registration links for that. But thank you everyone for participating, attending, and have a great rest of the week.
Thank you so much.
And go enjoy lunch.
Bye, everybody.
Take care.